In today's session, we are going to learn about variables and formulas. And this is some of the most advanced things that we can do with ProtoPie, and you can do some really, really cool stuff. And I'm very excited to take you through it. Just wanted to just quickly give you a recap on what we did on the last meeting. You'll remember that we went through doing some conditional logic. So we learned how to use a condition, and we learned how to use the chain trigger and the range trigger. In today's, we're going to be building on all of that amazing stuff that we learned. Give me 1 second and I'll get us back to the right slide, which is here. We're going to be building on all of the amazing things we learned, and we're going to learn how to use detect. We're going to learn how to use receive, and we are going to learn how to use send and assign. So 2 new triggers, detect and receive, and 2 new responses, send and assign. And these will give us some of the most, this will bring out some of the most capable items that ProtoPie can do. We have a bunch of demos to go through today. We are going to learn how to create a component. We're going to learn what a variable is and how to use it. We are going to work with multi-screens, and this is a very cool feature of ProtoPie where you can have 2 prototypes talking to each other, one affecting the other. The first demo we're going to do is simulating setting the focus point for a camera. So you would tap somewhere on the screen and the camera would focus on that point, and the focus point would be reflected on the screen. The second one is a very simple example of how we can use a variable. So we'll be able to take your name, type it in one screen, and then reuse it on another screen. We are going to learn how to make a component, and we are going to learn how to make interactions with these components. And in the last couple of demos, we are going to have a couple of prototypes talking to each other. For the first set of demos, we're going to be building out our smart light control. And then what we're going to do is simulate your phone affecting a panel that you might have mounted in your home. And as you change the level of brightness in the living room on your phone, for example, it's reflected on this panel. So at this point, I need you to download 2 files. Rebecca's going to share a link in the chat. There will be 2 files this time around. All the other sessions have been 1 file. Today's will be 2. And the one you're going to start with is the one that says send in the title. There'll be one that says receive in the title, one that says send. You want the one that says send, and that should be the phone prototype that we're going to start with. The download link, like always, will be on the left side when you follow the link that Rebecca shared. And I'll just give you a couple of minutes. And since there's only 3 of us, just all 3 of you, when you guys have the file opened in ProtoPie, just shoot back in the chat and let me know you're ready to go. Oh, one more thing. I want to remind everybody that today's session is 2 hours. It's a long session. We have a lot to get through, whereas all of the other sessions were 1 hour. So if you weren't prepared for 2 hours, just letting you know that it will be 2 hours. We'll take a short break in the middle, just a few minutes, because there'll be a lot to go through. So give you a chance to take a break, drink some water, whatever you need to do. Everybody's done. Okay, excellent. So from here, then, we are going to jump into ProtoPie and start with our first demo. So the first one we're going to do is a very simple example of how to build a formula. If you've ever used Excel before and you've used formulas in Excel, this is going to look very familiar to you. If everybody can go to the camera scene, and you should be set on something that looks like this. And if I preview this, you're going to see we get this, this stripy moving thing. If you were previewing this on your phone, you would actually see the camera's image. But since we're doing this on our desktop right now, we don't get the camera in here. Not consequential to what we're doing. What we are going to demonstrate is, you can see this box in the middle. That represents the camera's focus point. What we want to do is we want to set this up such that that box moves to wherever I tap in the picture. And we're going to use a formula to do this. So the first thing we want to do is we want to figure out what trigger we want to do. Our trigger is a tap. So anytime we tap on the camera's picture, we want that to be our trigger. So let's click on the camera layer, and we're going to add a tap trigger. And then the response that we want when we tap is we want to move this box. So we're going to choose the focus layer, which is at the top of the stack, and we will add a move response. Now, the question you might be asking yourself is, move to where? Normally, when we set something up in here, we'll put in explicit pixel numbers in here, right? But I could tap anywhere in here. So the place that I'm going to move this is not known until I actually tap on here. So whenever you have something that is dynamic in this nature, you can use something called formulas in ProtoPie to fill in the blanks, to use the conditions of your prototype at any given point in time to fill in an unknown variable. And in this case, if you notice, when you click in the box, there's a little FX icon. This means formula. If you click on that, the box will expand a little bit. And you have a couple of options here on the right-hand side that can help you write your formula. We're going to click on this question mark icon. And if you click on that, that is going to open your browser into some online help that you can find on ProtoPie's website. And this tells you all about how formulas work and how to use them. And I suggest after this session, by the way, that you go through and you read through all of this, which will teach you how to use all of the formulas. But in particular, what I want you to focus on is this second subsection called variables. And in here, we're going to find out that there are some predefined variables or some predefined properties that are available for you to use within ProtoPie. And there's a brief explanation as to what these are. So you've got mouse X, mouse Y, and that's the X coordinate of the mouse pointer and the Y coordinate of the mouse pointer. And that's as your focus moves around. You've got touch X and touch Y, and that's the spot where you touched. Touch velocity, that's the speed when you're swiping, for example. And there's a bunch of other ones. And I invite you to read through these after the session so you can find out what they do. But as you can imagine by the description, we are interested in these two, the X coordinate of where we touched and the Y coordinate of where we touched. And those are called touch X and touch Y. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this touch X, and you're going to notice it's touch capital X. The case is important here. If you use touch X with a lower X, this wouldn't work. But to avoid errors like that, I'm just going to copy this, and I'll go back to ProtoPie. And I have two coordinates that I want this box to move to, X and Y. In the X box, I'm going to press the function button, and I'm going to paste the touch X property. And if I go back to my help here and I copy the touch Y one, I'm going to use that in the touch Y box. And say, okay. Now I'm going to show you what I mean about how this is case sensitive. If I were to use lowercase x, you're going to see that ProtoPie turns this orange. It lets me know that something's wrong. So the response is colored orange. You have the orange dot, and there's an orange outline on the box where the problem is. And additionally, inside a formula, when you click on it, you get this red underline. So it tells you which part of your formula has a problem. In our case, we only have one thing, so it's got the whole thing underlined. But I'm going to change this back to the capital X. So what's going on here is, if I were to preview this, anytime I click on the camera picture, you're going to see that box moves around, and it moves to wherever I tapped. Now, this is just scratching the surface of how we can use dynamic properties to make very believable and very lifelike prototypes in here. We're going to go through many more examples that get more complicated than this, but this is a great introduction of how to write a formula. Before I move on to the next demo, are there any questions? If you have any, please write them in the chat. Okay, excellent, all good. So let's move on to our next demo. And I'm gonna go back to the keynote here and just go through and explain a little bit about what we're going to do. What we want to do is, if you recall in our previous session, we set up this setting screen such that if you put in 2 passwords, we did a comparison to see if they matched. But there's a third field here where you can fill in your name. What we want to do is when you fill in your name, we want to reuse it on another scene in our prototype. So I'm going to type in this case, the example would have been Leah typing her name in the your name field. And then when we click save, it's going to jump us over to the IoT home scene, and it's going to say, hi, Leah. And if I pull out the drawer on the left that gives us our menu, it will also have Leah's name there. And it's going to reflect whatever we type into that name field. So in this field, we're going to type something, and we are going to store this somewhere. We're going to save this in a place where we can retrieve it later. And then when we bring up this scene, we are going to plug this in when the scene starts. So that way, when you see it, the name will appear there. We're going to use something called detect. The detect trigger uses, it will watch any property of an object that you choose. And anytime that property changes, it will fire. And whatever response you put under there will be executed. In this case, we're going to detect a change in that name field. So as you type, as you put more letters in there, you add more, you remove more, that detect will fire every single time you type a letter in there. Then we're going to use the assign response to assign this to something called a variable. Now, variable sounds a little bit scary. The word variable is a programming term, which makes it a little bit intimidating, but it's very simple to understand. A variable is a mechanism to store a piece of information, and that information can change over time. It can vary, hence the name variable. And in ProtoPie, you can set up as many variables as you need to store as much information as you need. We're going to use one. We're going to use one to store the name as people type into the name field. So as I type Leah in here, the detect will fire. It will assign to the variable we create, and we can use that later when we want to. All right, so if I now go back, and we're going to jump into a different scene here, and we're going to go onto the settings screen. And again, you'll recall we worked with this time last time where we did the password comparison. We're going to be working with this field this time. And anytime something changes in this field, we are going to assign it to a variable. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add that detect trigger. So we'll add a trigger, and we use detect, and it's almost right in the middle here. And the first thing you have to choose is what is it that you want to detect a change in? And we have a, well, let's change this field name first of all. So this one here that's called input one, that's actually the name field. Let's change it to be a bit more relevant to what we're dealing with here, and we'll just call it name. And that way, when we use it later, it makes a little bit more sense. In my detect trigger, I'm going to choose that name layer, and the property that I want to detect a change in is its text property. Anytime that text property changes, I want detect to do something. So I'm going to choose text. Now, if you recall, what I said was, as we type in here, we want to take the value of that and we want to assign it to something. We want to assign it to a variable. So we're going to use something called the assign response. That's this bottom right one right here. Now, the question you're first asked is what you want to assign information to. And we don't have any variables set up. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create one. If you go all the way to the bottom left of your screen, you've got this drawer that says variable. And if you click it, it expands up. And now you have a panel that will show you any variables you might have created in your scene. If you press this plus, this will give you the option to create new ones. But you have two options. You have for all scenes, and you have for this scene. And the difference between these two is exactly as you might expect. If I only want to use the information stored in this variable only in this scene, then I would choose this scene. If I need to use that information in another scene or any other scene, then I would use for all scenes. And since what we want to do is we want to save this and then use it in another scene, we're going to choose the for all scenes option. And I got one created called variable one. Variable one is not a great name. So let's double click it. And we want to name this for the kind of, we want to name this for what we want to store in here. And we're going to store the name in here. Question in the chat, why would you never want to have all scenes? And in fact, you can just always use the for all scenes option in here, but what that means is, let's say you create 20 variables. This list will always be 20 variables on any of the scenes that you have. So if I go over to this scene, for example, you're going to see the variable I created is visible there. And if I go into the IoT Ohm, it's available there. But let's say I created one for just this scene, and I'm not going to bother naming it because this is just for demonstrative purposes. If I go to another scene, you're going to notice that variable's not there. So it just kind of helps you with organization. If you create something very complicated where you've got 20, 30 variables, but most of them are only used in a particular scene, it just helps keeps things organized. So that way you don't see a particular variable on another scene where you're not even going to use it. But you are safe in setting up your variables for all scenes if you're unsure, and you can't change a variable to an all scenes variable later. So if you're unsure that maybe you might want to use it in another scene, it's a good idea to just choose all scenes. So now if I go back to the settings here, did that answer your question, by the way? Yes, excellent. Okay. I'm going to delete this variable, and deleting a variable is a matter of you highlight it and press the delete key on your keyboard. But I want to work with this name one. But there's a couple of things we need to do first here to set it up before we can use it. The first thing we did is we named it, and you can name this anything you want, but it's a good idea to name it something that indicates the kind of information you're going to store in there. And in this case, in this case, we're going to store the name. But the other thing you need to do is you need to tell it what type of information you're going to store in here. We're not going to store a number. We want to store text. We want to store what people have typed on the keyboard. So we need to change. We need to change its type from number to text. The difference between these ones is, let's say you want to do some math on the information you store in there, then you might want to use a number variable. But since we want to store letters and numbers and potentially special characters or anything, we want to store text, we're going to use text. You have an option to default this to something. In our case, I don't want this defaulted to anything, but let's say somebody didn't put anything in the name field. I could have something in here that would default to. So let's say I wanted to use Jeff as the default. That would be the value that is retrieved if we don't do anything to assign it anything at any point. But I'm going to leave it blank. The third type we can use is color. We're not going to go past that, but it is possible to use color as a variable in your prototypes as well. You'll find information on that on the website, and if you're interested in doing that in some of your work. In our case, we're going to use text. If we go back to our assign response, we're now going to select the variable we just made, and we call it name. We're going to select name. Now we need to write a formula to tell ProtoPie what information we want to store in the name variable. In this case, it's going to get a little bit more complicated. What we want to do is we want to take whatever the value of this text field's property is, we want to assign it to this variable. Like we did before, we can use this help icon to give us a bit more clues on what we need to do. So if we go back to the online help, and you can go to this subtask or this subsection called syntax. Now, syntax is just a fancy word for how you format things. Again, sounds complicated, but it just means how you format things. And this very first one, where you can use a layer and a property of that layer, this is what we're going to use. It works with the name of the layer surrounded by backticks, and then the backtick is the one that leans towards the left. And then you use a dot, and then the name of the property. Now you can type this, or we can use some help that ProtoPie gives us to avoid typing errors, and we can use this plus button. And the plus button will give us all of the layers in our prototype that we can choose. And what we would like is the name field. So I'm just going to move down here to name, click it. Then I'm going to type dot. And then when I do that, I'm going to get a list of all of the properties that are available to me that I can use. And I want the text property. So if I preview this, there's nothing to indicate that this is working. I can type my name in here, and you can take my word for it that this is assigning it to the variable. But let's say you want a proof of that before we moved on to the next step. ProtoPie offers a way to monitor the value of a variable at any point in time. So if you go back to your variables panel in the bottom left here, You're going to notice that when you hover over the variable, there's a little ladybug icon that shows on the right side of it. If you click that, you'll get this green box that appears in your prototype, and you can move this around anywhere. And what this is doing is this is showing the value of that variable. Now you remember that we left the default blank, and therefore it's showing up blank. But if I were to put a default value in here, you're going to see Jeff appears in here. So this will always show whatever the value of this variable is at any point in time during the execution of your prototype. I'm going to remove the default again. But if we have this showing, now when I type, you're going to see as I type, this updates, and as I backspace, so anytime I type anything into this, it is being assigned to my variable. And this is how you know it's working. Now, this is not a part of your prototype per se. It's not a layer in the same way that all of these guys are. It's just a way to monitor the value of this variable. And you can turn it on and off at any time. So I have it off here, I turn it on, I can move it around to wherever I want. And even in the preview, you'll see it in the preview, I can even move it around in the preview. But the difference between moving around the preview is it doesn't stick in the location that you put it. If I reset the preview, you're going to see it move back to wherever it was in the studio here. In any case, I'm just going to leave it. I'm going to leave it on for now. So we've got our assign working. Now we want to use this variable in another scene. So let's now go to the IoT home scene. And you're going to see that if I preview this, I have a name in two places. I have the greeting at the top of the screen here that says, "Hi, Jessica." And if I pull the drawer from the left, and you just need to click and drag from anywhere on this left edge here, you're going to see the name Jessica is here as well. We want to replace these with our actual dynamic information, whatever name was put in it in the last scene. You'll also notice that this name box persists because this is a variable that is used across scenes. Then you'll continue to see this green box on any of the scenes as long as you have it turned on. And I can turn it off, I can turn it on. I'm going to leave it on. So in this scene, what I want to do is I want to take the information that's in here and I want to plug it in. I want to replace the information that we have in these two text fields. We have a trigger. We have a trigger for things to happen when the scene starts. And you will all recall that that is the start trigger. And I'm going to use that here. So if we go in this one, it's a little bit north of the middle. And I'm going to change this to start with jump. So that way the change is immediate. It really is only important when you have transitions in between, but I don't want to see Jessica change to whatever it happens to be. I want to see the name in there immediately when this scene starts. So I'm going to use the start with jump option in here. And what I want to do then is I need to modify text. We have a text response for that. I'm going to start with this one here because this one's a little bit easier to work with than this one. This one's a little bit trickier because we have this high comma ahead of the name. So it's a little bit trickier to do this one. I'm going to start with the easier one of the two, and that's just filling in the name. So in the name, or in this text field, I'm going to choose the first one that just says Jessica. And again, let's rename these layers. Because these are dynamic, I don't want to say Jessica. I want it to say name. Or maybe we want dynamic name, if that helps you remember it a little bit better. And maybe we call this one dynamic greeting. We're going to change the dynamic name layer. So if I go to the text response, I'm going to choose dynamic name. And I have two options for the text. I could just type something in here, but that's not dynamic. That's going to put whatever I type in this box, it's going to put that in the text field. I want this to use the value in my variable. So like we used a formula to assign the value to the variable, we can use a formula to retrieve that variable. And we're going to do that. We're going to choose formula. And once again, we have our formula box. If I hit the plus button, not only are all my layers here, but I don't know if you noticed before, any variables you've created are here as well. And we use the name variable. I'm just going to click that and I'll say OK. And let's now go back to the setting scene and let's test this. Let's see if this is working. If everything worked as I expected, if I put my name in here and I click save, and I pull the drawer over here, and there we go. We see my name. Okay, cool. So if that worked, we can do something very similar to fill in this one. And because this is also a text field, we're going to use another text response in our start trigger. So I will add a text response. The layer that I want to modify is now our dynamic greeting. I want this to be a formula because we're going to use our variable. But this formula is going to be a little bit different because we want to attach the static text hi, comma, in front of the name. Let's go back to our online help. If we click the question mark again, that'll take us back to this page over here. And in syntax, you're going to see a bunch of different ways that we could make a formula. And if we scroll down a little bit, you're going to see a section called arithmetic operations. And you might think of this as math, 1 + 2, 5 × 5, that kind of thing. And that certainly is something you can do. But you can also use these kind of operations with text. And you can join two pieces of text together using the plus symbol. So you're going to see I have hello plus world, and static text, by the way, is indicated by double quotes surrounding it. So this word hello is static text, and I know that because it's surrounded in double quotes. The word world is also static text because it is surrounded by double quotes. And interestingly, if you use text and you have numbers in between, ProtoPie won't do math on those. It's not going to say 1 + 2 = 3. It's going to join these two pieces together because by using the double quotes in here, you said this is static text and this is static text. So the answer you get, or the result you get, is 1, 2, the text 12 joined together. If you were to do text plus a number, ProtoPie is smart enough to figure out that you can't do math in this way. So if I had 1, 2, 3, 4 as a number plus 5, 6, 7, 8, it would do math. It would give you the result of that sum. But because I've taken static text at the start of this, and then I've said plus a number, ProtoPie will give you a text result. So hello, 1, 2, 3, 4. In the same way that we can take static text and attach on a number or another piece of text, we can attach on a variable. So we can have our first start of our greeting, hi, comma, and then say plus, and then the name of our variable, and that will plug in the value of that variable and give us a text output when we're done. So if I go back here in my formula, and we're going to use the double quotes, and we're going to type hi, comma, and close the quotes. Then we'll use the plus symbol. Now you don't have to put spaces in between things, like you can do it this way. I like to have spaces in here, just makes it a bit more readable. But I can just type the name variable, or I can use the plus and choose the variable from here if I don't trust my own typing. And I'm going to say okay to that. And let's go back to our settings scene. And notice that I use the navigation buttons at the top here instead of going back to the scenes. We can use this to hop back and forth quickly to the scenes. And then if I use the right arrow, that'll take me back to the IoT home scene when we're ready to test it back out. If I preview this and I type my name, Jeff, and I click save, you're going to see it says, hi, Jeff. Except it's not quite perfect, is it? It says hi, comma, Jeff, but there's no space in between hi and Jeff. Now, computers are funny things. Computers will do exactly what you tell them to do, and it won't do things that you don't tell it to. In our assign, sorry, I'm in the wrong scene here. So if I just use the right arrow, I'm going to jump back to this scene. In our assign, we wanted to attach the text hi, comma, to the word name, but we didn't tell it to put a space in between. So as part of our text here, a space is a valid piece of text. So I'm going to put hi, comma, space between my quotes. And now when I preview this, and I'll go back to my IoT home scene. I'll preview this. I'm going to type my name. I'll use a different name this time. Let's use the name Monica, just to prove that it's using whatever I type. I click save. It says, hi, Monica. And if I pull the drawer over here, it still says Monica over here. All right, so that is how you use a variable combined with a formula, and how you can use that information across multiple scenes. One question in the chat: are conditionals also available for syntax? For example, if the text input is too long and I'd like to truncate. Example, if text is greater than 30 characters, assign name plus ... Yes, in fact, you can do that. I'm not going to go through an example here because we have a lot to go through, but if we have time at the end, I will take you through an example of how to do that. But the short answer is yes. Any other questions on this? Okay, excellent. Let's move on to our next demo. Our next demo is going to be all about creating components. Let's go into the smart light scene. We're not going to be using the name variable anymore for the stuff that we're doing, so I'm just going to turn off the monitor for that variable. In this scene, we have what simulates a smart light control on your phone. And the idea is if I were to click and drag here, I could adjust the lighting value, the lighting brightness in my kitchen or my bedroom, dining room, living room, etc. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create the control that responds to our clicking and dragging. And then we'll have the numeric here reflect the value. So when I'm all the way at the left, it's going to say 0%. And when I'm all the way at the right, it's going to say 100%. Then we're going to turn this into a reusable component. So that way we don't have to duplicate our work to create the other ones. You'll notice that the design is very similar, almost identical, in fact. Everything's in the same spot, and it only really differs by the text name of the room, the icon that's beside it, and the slider value. So let's start by building our functional piece here. What we would like is we would like to be able to drag on here and adjust the size of this pinkish bar here. And then you might want to ask yourself, what is the right thing to set up a drag on? So let's add a drag trigger. Let's start this, and then we'll go through and we'll talk about it. So I'm going to use the drag trigger, which is a little bit bottom left here. And we have to select the layer that we want to drag on. We're going to be working with the kitchen group, so we can ignore the rest of them for now. And we could say we want to put the drag on the slider. And if we take a look at which one that is, slider is the pink one, slider BG is the gray one, right? Let's try using the drag on the slider. And then as we drag, we want to adjust the scale of that object. So let's choose scale as a response. And let's just preview this for now and see what happens. So if I just click on this pink one and I drag, you're going to see not only can I drag it left and right, but I can drag it up and down. But there's another problem that if I drag it all the way to the right, it disappears. And then I have nothing to drag on now. So a couple of things to fix here. We maybe don't want to use the slider object as our drag trigger target. Maybe we want to use the gray background as our drag. So that way, if anywhere I drag on here, it's going to modify the size of this object on here. So let's change this to the slider background. And again, I am working with the kitchen group. So I want the slider background in the kitchen group. And now if I preview this, and if I click and drag in the gray here, that's doing what I need. But if I click and drag on the pink, it doesn't. It's not dragging. How do we fix that? Anybody have an idea? All right, I'll tell you, that's fine. In the slider, what we can do is we can set in the properties panel. If you scroll all the way, or if you look all the way to the right, and then at the bottom of the properties panel, you have this option, make lower layers touchable. And what this allows to do is whenever the finger comes in contact with your phone or when you click with the mouse, it allows that click to transfer down into layers that are underneath. And if we turn that on for lower layers touchable on the slider layer, and we preview this, you're going to see now I can drag on the pink part and I can drag on the gray part, and that's doing what we need. If I click on the number, however, it doesn't drag. So we got to do the same thing for the number. So if I click on the 40% layer and I click on make lower layers touchable, and I preview this now, if I start my drag on the number, that works. If I start my drag on the pink portion, it works. And if I start my drag on the gray portion, always works. All right, let's fix this problem we have where this is deforming and it's getting larger. And let's also set it up a limit so that we can't drag past. We want to limit it to just the gray area. Those are all handled in the same place. If we look at the scale response, you're going to see you have a direction option. And this is the part of the object of where the scale will happen. So in this case, the scale is happening from the lower right corner. And what I want is I want the scale to start from the right edge. Now, if I do this and if I can see if I move up and down, it's not scaling up and down. So it's only scaling the right edge outward, and that's what I want. If I were to instead use this leftward one, because you might say, what's the difference between the two? And I preview this, you're going to see that if I drag, it's actually scaling the left edge. We don't want that. We want the left edge to remain fixed, and the right edge is the one we want to move, which is why we use the right arrow in the direction. The second thing we want to do is we want to set a limit on it. So the minimum width of our slider is obviously 0. The maximum width is the same width as our slider background. So we just want to take this width is 279. I'm just going to copy that. And I'm going to plug that into our maximum width of the scale. And since I'm only working with the width property in my scale, I'm just going to leave the min and max heights alone. I'm not going to put anything in there. And now when I scale this left and right, you're going to see it's now limited. Okay, so we have a question in the chat. Could we just group 40% slider and slider BG and add triggers on that group, or do we always need to use the make lower layers? So there's it's there. You could do it that way. So let's say we did this and we grouped this and we call this container 1, we call this slider container. And we can make the drag instead on our slider container. And if we preview that, this should work. Right, so yeah, that does what we would expect. That is another way you could do it. And then you don't have to worry then about the lower layers touchable because the group is the topmost layer here. If I preview this, all right, yeah, that works. I'm going to undo all this though, because I'm going to work with the layers as we had it before. And I just want to make sure everybody's got the same thing here. So I've got my drag is on the slider background again. Let me just preview it and make sure that still works. Okay, great. Oh wait, no, I undid the limit. So I have to go set my limit again. Scale to maximum width of 279. Okay, that sounds good. Now you can see we've got a couple of other problems going on here. You're going to see that as I scale this left and right, the shape deforms. It gets more oblong as I make it wider, and it gets a bit more flat as I make it smaller. And this is because the layer is actually an image. This was imported from Figma at some point, and in Figma, it started its life as a shape. But anytime you do an import from Figma or Sketch, everything comes in as a bitmap. But ProtoPie is smart enough to recognize that this was a shape at one point, and you have the ability to turn it back into a shape. And you can see that by looking at the icon, and you can see it's an image icon with a little circle in the bottom right corner of it. This lets you know that this was a shape at one point, and you can turn it back into a shape. And you can do that by clicking on the layer, and on the right-hand side in the properties panel, you have this option, make editable. And if I do that, you're going to see now my layer changed. The icon now has a square indicating it's now a shape. And this shape has a radius. And when I scale this, that radius will remain constant. So if I preview this now, you can see as I drag this, oh, wait a minute, I don't have the lower layers touchable turned on. Turn that on for the slider. 40% is already there. Okay, so now if I drag this left and right, you're going to see my shape remains the right radius the whole time. The only time it deforms a little bit is when you go down and all the way to the 0 mark, and you can see it gets a little bit smaller as we go there. And that's only because the shape is not wide enough to do the full radius that's on there. But the second I get to a minimum width, you can see it gets the radius, and then it just continues to have that radius. For our demonstrative purposes, this is good enough, and this behaves the way that we want. The last thing we want to do, is there any way, there's a question in the chat, is there any way to remove the automatic conversion to bitmaps, or when would bitmaps be useful? I don't 100% know the answer to this, but I don't believe there is. I think when you do the import, everything comes in as a bitmap, and then you can pick and choose. I believe there's a performance gain by having everything as a bitmap. It's a little bit more difficult to render vectors and text for ProtoPie. So by having everything come in as a bitmap, you get a little bit of a performance gain. So if you just make the things into vectors and text that you need to, you get the gain of everything else being a bitmap. Does that answer your question? Okay, excellent. Okay, the last thing we want to do is we want this numeric display to change as we scroll left and right. So as we get all the way to the right, we want this to be 100%. And as we get all the way to left, we want this to be 0. And as we get somewhere in the middle, we want that to reflect where we are. So if I'm at the halfway point, I'd like that to be 50%. You might be asking yourself, hey, I know a trigger we can use for that. It's called the chain trigger. And that's exactly what we're going to do. And that's how we learned this in the last lesson. We're going to reuse the chain trigger. So we're going to add a trigger, call it chain. And we want to chain the slider's width property. So as the width of the slider object changes, we want to update this number accordingly. And we can use a, we can't change the text. We have a problem here. What we would like to do is we'd like to change the value of that text field accordingly with the width of the value. But you'll notice text is not an option in here. It's grayed out. I could change the scale of something, the rotate or anything. And the interesting thing about text is it doesn't really have an intermediary value between one value and another. So there's nothing really to chain. There's no way for ProtoPie to guess what that value should be in between. But you will notice of the items that we do have that are available, and that's these highlighted white items, we have assign. And we can chain the assignment of a value to a variable to the width of this slider. So let's try that out. Let's use assign. And we need to create a variable. We don't want to use this name variable because that was something we used in another scene. Let's create another one. So on our bottom left, we're going to create a new variable. And I'm just going to use the for this scene because I only want this to affect just what I see in here. You'll notice that this slider is not something that appears in any other scene if you were to go through these kind of things. So I'm just going to set up for this scene. And again, this is for organizational purposes. Say for this scene, and let's say we call this brightness, because we're going to be storing a number that represents the light brightness in here, all the way from 0% up to 100%. So let's call this brightness. And because this is going to be a number in a range of 0 to 100, I want to make sure that the type is a number, and that's the default. And we'll default it to 0. That's not going to be a big deal because it will respond to this chain and update accordingly. So I'm going to go back to my assign response and pick this new brightness variable that I created. And I'm going to make a range. Now it defaults in here the initial size of this width, but I want my range to be the width of 0 to the width of 279. So that's my minimum width and my maximum width. If you recall from our scale in here, minimum width, maximum width. And I want to map that to a 0% brightness and 100% brightness. So when the width of my slider width is at 0, my brightness is at 0. And when my width of my slider is at 279 pixels, then my brightness value is at 100. And if you recall from our previous lesson, ProtoPie fills in the blanks in between. So when your slider width is halfway in between, that's about 140 pixels, then this will be at 50%. Now that we have this, we would like to use this. We want to use this and we want to fill in this text. If you remember, we had a trigger that can monitor for when anything changes. So whenever a property changes, do you remember what that was? We used it in the last lesson, or in the last demo, I mean. Anybody know in the chat? Okay, yes, the detect trigger, that's correct. We are going to reuse the detect trigger, because not only can you use detect to detect a change in the property of any of your layers, you can also use it to detect the change in the value of a variable. So let's detect the value of brightness. Before we do anything with this, let's prove, by the way, that this is working as we expect. Let's turn on the monitor for this and just make sure that, okay, so ProtoPie automatically filled in the 50.9, reflecting that I'm at the more or less halfway point. And if I move this left and right, you're going to see that value changes accordingly. So that proves that it's working. What we want is we want this number plugged in here. I'm going to turn that back off again. So I'm going to detect the change in the value, and I'm going to do something with it. And as you might guess, we're going to use a text response because we want to update the value of that text field. And the layer we want to do is, once again, I'm going to name this accordingly. So we call this dynamic brightness. Oops, I can't type. Dynamic brightness. And I want to update the text property of, oh, wait, what's going on here? That dynamic text field is not showing up here. Anybody know why? You can say in the chat if you think you know. It's a bitmap, very good. Exact same problem we had with the slider. The dynamic brightness, also imported from Figma, came in as a bitmap. But just like the slider, ProtoPie was smart enough to recognize that it began its life as a shape. ProtoPie also recognizes that this layer began its life as a text field. And we can do the same thing we did for the slider, and that is select the layer, make it editable. And this now turns it into a dynamic text field. Now in my text, I can select that layer, dynamic brightness. There it is. And we want to use a formula because this is dynamic information. We don't want to put static information in here. We're going to use a formula. And if I click the FX button, and let's click the plus on here and select our brightness variable. And before we add anything else to it, let's just add the brightness in here, say okay, and let's preview this. And let's just make sure that this is doing what we expect it to do. So if I preview this and I move this left and right, you can see now that that text is updating dynamically as I move it. There are a couple of problems we need to deal with. Number one, it doesn't have the percent tacked onto the end of it. And it also has a decimal that's on here. And we want to get rid of the decimal. We just want the whole number portion of it. We don't need that precise for our lighting. Let's get rid of the decimal first. In our formula, if I press the FX button on here, we can actually do a little bit of work on this variable, on the value of this variable to change the output that is in here. And we can use something called a function. If we click on the question mark icon again, and that will take us back to our online help, you're going to see one of the 5 subsections under formulas is functions. And ProtoPie has a number of functions that are built in that do a bunch of things. There's a length function, which can tell you the length of the text. And that talks to a previous question, by the way, by Sarah. This would be how you would figure out the length of text and do something with it, make a decision on it. There are a bunch that are in here, and I invite you to read through what all of these do. But what we are interested in is, because we're working with numbers, we're going to go down to these math ones. And there are a bunch of mathematical functions that we can use. And there are a few here that we can actually use for what we want. You may have already guessed that we want to use the round function. And what this will do is it will round your number to the nearest whole number. So if you have 1.5 in there, it rounds it to 2. And if you had 1.1, it would round it to 1. And that sounds more or less like what we want to do. So we could just copy this. And you can recognize a function, by the way, because a function has a name and then it has a bracket, something in between that you want that function to work with, and then a closing bracket. All functions look like this. I'm going to copy this round bracket portion of it. We'll go back to ProtoPie. And I want to put my cursor at the front. I want to put it in front of brightness, and I'm going to paste that. And you're going to notice that ProtoPie underlined this in red because I haven't closed the function. So if I add the closing bracket to it, you're going to see now I have round on here, and I've hit OK to that. Let's preview this. And now as I drag this, you're going to see all I have is that whole number. Okay, now I did mention that there were a couple of other functions that would work. And these two, there's floor and then there's seal. Floor means floor, seal means ceiling. And these are similar to the round function, but in the case of floor, it will always just return the whole number below. So 1.5, 1.9, 1.2, it will always return 1. And ceiling is the opposite. So if you got 1.1, 1.2, 1.8, it'll always return 2. It goes to the next whole number above or below. You could have used these as well. I think the round makes a little bit more sense. Okay, there's a question in the chat. How could you round this from 2 decimals to a single decimal? You can do that, and it requires a little bit of math. And this is a number, another one that I can show you after the course if you're willing to stick around. But you can do a little bit of math in your function to be able to handle this. But it is possible. Okay, and then the last thing we want to do is we want to tack on the percent to our brightness level. And if you recall, percent is a bit of static text. So I'm going to use the plus, open quotes, percent symbol, close the quotes. And if I click on OK, let's just take a look at what this formula is doing. It's taking the value of brightness, rounding it to the nearest whole number, and tacking on the percent symbol on the end. That is what our formula is doing. And whatever the result of that is gets plugged into our dynamic brightness field. So let's preview this and make sure it is doing what we expect. And as we move left and right, you can see that is doing what we expect. All right, cool. Now we just need to do that 3 more times, right? No, we don't have to do that 3 more times. What we can do is we can turn this into a bad readability down near, okay, yes, there's a comment in the chat, bad readability down near 0 there. Yes, that is correct. And we could use the detect trigger, by the way, to say when it gets down below, say 16, maybe we change the color. You can do that if you'd like. I'll leave that up to you to figure out how the best way to handle it. What we can do is we don't have to duplicate our work. We don't have to do everything that we did here 3 more times, or 5 more, or 10 more, depending on how many of these sliders we want. We can take this and turn this into a reusable module called a component. And that's a really simple thing to do. If I click on the kitchen group, and if you look at the top here, you have this icon called component. If you click on that, that will convert our item to component. Now the icon has changed. You can see how it has this green box with a lightning bolt in it. That indicates that now this is a component. And there's a matching icon in your drawer on the far left here underneath your scenes icon. So if I click on this one here, you're going to see all the components that are in here. And it named it kitchen because that was the name of the group. And then it added kitchen 1 under the end on here. What this is indicating is the difference between the main component and a copy of it. If you've ever used components in something like Figma or Sketch, the idea is similar. You have a master and you have a copy of it. In ProtoPie, we call this the main component. And we call any copies that you use in your scene, we call these instances. Any change I make to my main component will be reflected in any and all instances I have in my scene here. You can imagine that we're going to have 4 copies of this. And if I were to change the color of this slider to be something else, then that would update all 4 of these to have that color if I made that change in the main component. Now, the interesting thing here is it's named the component kitchen, which was what the group was called kind of thing. But in our case, this component is not the kitchen component. This is a component for changing the light level, a light slider component, if you will. So what I'd like to do is I'd actually like to rename this and call this light slider. The name that you have in the scene, the instance, is still going to be whatever you want to call it. And we can call this kitchen. We can call it kitchen light slider. Right? You can do whatever you want. I'm just going to use kitchen. Just keep it simple. We'll call this kitchen. If we want to make some changes, if we want to modify our components, if we want to modify the main component, you can do that by clicking the component drawer. And you can click on the component. If you double click it, you will go into edit mode for that component. And you're going to notice that we have some problems here. We have some things that are in orange here. ProtoPie does a pretty good job of taking over all of the triggers and responses, but you'll notice it didn't bring across our variable. Components can have variables too, but you'll notice though there are none here. And if we preview this, you're going to see that my slide works, but my 40% is not updating to match whatever I've slid to. And all of these are in orange, and it is highlighting it saying, you're telling me to use a variable called brightness, but we don't have a variable named brightness. So it's a little bit of a quirk with how ProtoPie behaves, but if we go back to our scene and we just copy this variable, so I'm going to highlight it, Command C or Control C on Windows, and I will go back to my main component and Command V or Control V. I'm going to paste that variable there. And now you can see that fixed everything. And if I preview this, and you can preview components on their own outside of the scene, and you're going to see now it's working again. Just a little bit of a quirk that you need to be aware of, that when you convert something into a component, if it's using any variables, those don't come across into the main component. You have to copy them in. All right. So now back in our scene, and go back to the smart light scene. We have kitchen, bedroom, dining room, living room. These 3 are just placeholders, but we're not going to use these anymore. I'm just going to delete them. So I'm going to copy those 3 and delete them. And instead, what I'd like to do is I would like to create more instances of my light slider component. You can do that by opening the component drawer, and you can drag it into your scene, right? And I can just align them by dragging them, and you can use these smart guides. I can duplicate one. So if I click on one of them and I hit Command D, I will get another one, Command D or Control D on Windows, and I can hold the Option key while I drag this, and this will give me a copy as well. And the last thing I want to do is I want to make sure they're aligned properly. I think they're all centered properly because I copied them, and yeah, they're all centered properly, but I can align them such that it's spaced evenly vertically using this align option up here on my top right, and that just spaces them vertically. And you can verify that if you click on any one component, hold down the Option key and hover over another one, you can see there's 19 pixels between. And if I go to this one, Option or Alt, I hold that, there's 19 pixels in between. And this one is 20, so it's pretty close. If I want, I could just nudge that up one, and now I can have 19 in between all of them. And now they're perfect. And if I preview this, you're going to see that these all operate independently of each other. Now we want to customize these, because the first one says kitchen and it's for our kitchen, but the second one's not for our kitchen. The second one is for our bedroom, and the third one is for our dining room, and the fourth one is for the living room, right? Let's first rename these. So I'm going to drag these around a little bit just for some better organization. So I'm going to take the second one and I'm going to layer it below kitchen, And I'm going to call this, I think we said bedroom. And I'm going to take the third one and I'll just drag it in here. We'll call this dining room. And we'll drag the fourth one in and we'll call that living room. I also like the label to match the name that's in there. And you'll notice normally what we would do is we would click on that text and we would just customize it. And in ProtoPie, you can customize a component by just double clicking the text and typing something new. But you're going to see we have that same problem again, where the kitchen label is actually a bitmap, and we need to convert that over into dynamic text. So if I try to do that from here, if I try to do that from the scene within the instance of this component, you're going to see I don't have that option to make it editable. Does anybody have an idea of where I can go to make that editable? Change it in the main component. Yes, great. So we go into the main component. And like I mentioned before, any change to the main component will be reflected in all of the instant copies that you have. So I'm going to change this and make it editable. And let's rename this. So it doesn't say kitchen, but let's rename this. We'll call this room name. And if I go back to my scene, and again, I can use my navigation buttons at the top here. So I'll click this left arrow, takes me back to my scene. Now, if I double click this, I can change this. And we want to change this to say bedroom. A bunch of ways that you can make this text editable, by the way. So I just double clicked it. You can also, if you have it highlighted in the layers palette, you can press the enter key and that makes it editable. And this one was going to be dining room. And this last one is going to be, what did we say? This was going to be living room. Oops, I had my caps lock on. And also, if I wanted to change the icon, that can also be customized as well. So in this case, we're not going to bother doing that because you would have had to export some icon images from Figma. And in the interest of saving time, I'll just let you know that it's possible. But here where it says kitchen icon, I can replace it over here with another image. So if I exported those icons individually from Figma into graphic files, I could pick them and it would update that image. So the bedroom could have the icon of a bed that it originally had. Dining room could have its own icon, living room, etc. So all of these could be customized accordingly to match the room that we had. Okay, so we have now learned how to make a component that is reusable and customizable. Does anybody have any questions on that before I move on to the next little bit? Okay, no questions, great. This is right about the halfway point of our session here. So I'm gonna just suggest we take 5 minutes for a little bit of a break. So if you need to get some water or need to go to the bathroom, whatever, let's just take five minutes and then we'll meet back here. Okay, I see in the chat, Matt needs to drop off, but Lucian and Sarah, are you guys ready to continue? Sarah is, and Lucian? We'll give Lucian just another minute, I guess. Lucian, have you returned? Okay, I'm just going to wait one more minute and then we'll get started. So we still have quite a bit to get through. Excellent, Sarah. Great to hear. Hey, Lucian, have you returned? Okay, well, I'm going to get started anyway, just because we've got quite a bit to get through. Hopefully, Lucian joins us soon and we'll be able to just pick up exactly where we're at. In our previous section, what we did was we created a component that we reused 4 times. We can communicate with those components through something called send and receive. And this is one of the most powerful things you can do with ProtoPie. It allows you to send a message either to all your components or just one of them, and you can tell them to do something. What we want to do is we want this button to be a master switch, and we would like to use this to turn all of our lights off. So say it's bedtime, we're all ready to go to sleep. We can just hit this button, turn all the lights off, and it will instruct the kitchen, the bedroom, the dining room, and the living room to all go to 0% or turn the lights off. And we can use that. We can use something called send and receive to do it. We have in our arsenal of triggers here, we have something called receive. And in our responses, so we want it to happen when we tap this button, by the way. So let's add a tap trigger. We have a response called send. And that is this one right here, top right. So whenever I tap this button, I'm going to send that message to instruct all of these components to go to 0%. So let's see how that works. Let's add a send response to the tap trigger. Now, the first thing you have to choose is the channel you want to send to. And you have a bunch of options here. For the first little bit, we're going to be dealing with these two, send a component, send a current scene. And a little bit later, we're going to use this ProtoPie Studio one. But in this case, you need to know the difference between send a component and send to scene. And if you could picture somebody with a megaphone that wants to yell at everybody in the room, they would use this send to current scene. And this makes sure that everybody who's listening for the message is going to hear it. If I wanted to talk to one component in particular, let's say I just wanted to whisper in the ear of somebody, and I just want kitchen to do something, I would use send a component. And you're going to see I have the various ones that I could pick. I could pick one of them that I want to go to. But in this case, this is a master switch, and I want everybody to hear this message. So I'm going to send this message to the current scene. And then the message, now this is just anything you want to call it. And the only caveat that you have to worry about is whatever message you set up for the send, when you configure these components to receive it, it needs to be listening for the same message, and it needs to be typed exactly, and it is case sensitive. So let's say I wanted to call this message, turn all off. And what I like to do when I'm using send and receive is I like to rename my responses. So that way at a glance, I can see what's going on. So when I tap all off button, then I want to send, turn all off, and then I usually indicate the scene. So to scene. Now, if I preview this, if I click this button, nothing happens. And you can take my word for it that this message is getting sent, but we haven't told the components to listen for this message. So let's go into our main component. And remember when I said that when you send, you have to have something receive? We have that receive trigger that I mentioned before. Add trigger, receive. And again, the channel that I use here has to match the channel that I selected in the scene. So if we go back to the scene, you're going to see that my send is sending to current scene. So if I go back to my component, I want to receive from current scene. There are other options in here. We're going to deal with receive from parent a little bit later. This one, child component and current component, that's for sending and receiving within the component. It's a little bit beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about in here, but we are going to talk about current scene and we are going to talk about parent. We're sending the message to the current scene, so I need to listen to the current scene. And the message I put in here needs to match the one that I typed. And ProtoPie is smart enough to recognize that we have configured a send and it gives us a drop down. So we can either type it or we can just select it from the list. And that's what I'm going to do. That cuts down on typing errors. And I'm going to rename my receive. So receive, turn all off from scene. And then what I'd like to do is I would like to put this slider all the way at its minimum. Now you recall that everything is dependent on the width of this slider. So we can't just set the brightness level to 0 because that's not really going to work for what we want to do. We have to set the slider width to 0, and that in turn chains the value of brightness to 0. So in order for this to go to 0, we got to set the width of our slider. It's as if we had dragged this to 0. So we are going to scale. We're going to scale the slider, scale to 0. Let's go back to our scene. If this worked the way we expect, boom, they all go to 0. These still operate independently, by the way. So I can drag some of them up a little bit, some of them up a lot. Let's say this one goes 100%. And then when I click the turn all lights off button, then they all respond. And they all respond because they are all listening for a message sent to the scene, a message sent loud enough for everybody to hear. That's the way I like to describe sending a message to the scene. Any questions on that? Okay. Yes, it is very powerful, Sarah. Let us go on to the next little bit. So we worked with sending a message to the entire scene. Let's say we want all of these light sliders to be at different levels. So if I were to go into my IoT home scene, for example, and let's set this up so this is going to jump to our smart light scene. So that way from here, when I jump to this scene, right, this is likely not a believable scenario. It's very unlikely that all of my lights are at the exact same level. Maybe my kitchen is 100% because I'm cooking. Maybe my bedroom has a night light on and it's at 25%. Maybe nobody's in the dining room, so it's at 0. And maybe the living room is on at half brightness. What we would like to do is when this, not this scene, but if we go back to our smart light scene, whenever this scene starts, we would like to initiate all of these to different values. In the same way that we use send and receive to broadcast to everybody to do something, we can use send and receive to send individual messages to an instance of the component. And we'd like this to happen when the scene starts. So my trigger is the start trigger. So I'm going to say start. And same way as we did with the name before, I'm going to do start with the jump. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to send a message. Instead of to the current scene, I'm going to choose send to component. And when you choose send to component, you have to pick one instance that you want to send that message to. Think of this as whispering into the ear of one component, and that's the only one that can hear it. The other ones won't hear it. And I want to whisper in the kitchen, and I want to say I want to set brightness to 100%. So I'm going to create a message. We'll call this set brightness. But I want to tell it what brightness level to set it to. Actually, let's call this just set level. We'll call it set level. And I want to tell it what to set the level to. You have this option when you do a send and receive, or when you do a send, I should say, to send a little bit of extra information along the way. And you have this checkbox, send value together. And here, I can put something in here that I want to provide along with this set level to say what level to set it to. And in this case, the kitchen, I want to set it to its full brightness. Now you recall that we have to work with the width of the slider. So instead of saying 100% brightness, I'm going to use 279 because I want to set the slider width to 279. There is a way to work with brightness level 0 to 100%, but that's going to be a little bit more complicated. And I can show you how we could set that up. I can do that after the session if anyone's interested. But just to keep things simple for demonstrative purposes, we'll just work with the scale of the slider. And we know 100% brightness is the 279 pixel width. So I'm going to send set level 279 to the kitchen instance. And again, I'd like to name my components. So I'm going to say set level 279 to kitchen. And I want to do the same thing for the bedroom, but the bedroom I want at a lower value. So let's copy this. You can Command C, Command V, and I don't want to send it to the kitchen, but I want to send it to bedroom. And I don't want 279. I want, let's say about 25% width. We'll call that 70 pixels. And I can rename this to say set level 70 to bedroom. How you name your triggers and responses is completely up to you. This is what works to me, and that way I can see at a glance what my prototype is doing. And especially as your prototype starts to get more complicated and you have a lot of triggers and responses, seeing start, send, 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 send makes it a little bit difficult to read and know at a glance what's going on. You'd have to inspect each one to know what's going on. So I like to name mine to indicate at a glance what it is doing. Let's duplicate the bedroom. I can duplicate that with Command D or Control D on the Mac. And we're going to do the dining room. And let's say the dining room is off. So we're going to set the width to 0, send the message to the dining room. And we're set 0 to dining room. And similarly, I want to set the living room to 50% brightness. So I'll duplicate this again. Set level to living room, and 140 pixels is our halfway mark. And I'm going to set level 140 to living room. All right, so if I preview this, nothing happens. Because even though we're sending the message, we haven't configured the component to listen for it and do something with that message. So let's go back into our main component like we did before. And when we did the receive from the current scene, we can now do a receive for that set level message that we're sending. So I'm going to add the trigger. It's going to be receive. But instead of current scene, I want from parent. Now the naming doesn't quite match. I know you're thinking that, okay, well, if it's sent to the scene, I want to receive from the scene. And we say receive from parent, or we sent to the component. Why would it be receive from component? It doesn't match. And it would be a little bit more confusing if it was received from component, because it's like, well, what component? Is it its own component? Is it something else? So ProtoPie names it receive from parent. And that is essentially the receive counterpart to sending to component from the scene. So I'm going to say receive from parent. This is the parent whispering into the ear of the particular instance of this component. And the message, and you're going to see, I see the set level. You'll also notice that I'm not seeing the turn all off message listed here because it's shortlisted based on the channel. If I were to change this to current scene, what I see shortlisted here is just messages sent to the scene. But what I want are messages sent directly from the parent. I want that set level message. And you remember, we supplied a little bit of extra information along with it, and we supplied a number representing the width of the slider. We need to do something with that number, and that's this assigned to variable. You always have to assign that extra bit of information to a variable before you can do anything with it. So the first thing we do, let's create a variable. And we'll call this slider width, because that's exactly what this number represents, slider width. And it's a number. It's going to be a number from 0 to 279. And in my receive now, I want to assign that extra little bit of information to the variable slider width that we just made. And let's rename this receive set level from parent. And I want to do something with this receive. And that is, I want to set the scale of the width of the slider. And in the same way we had this scale setting it to 0, let's copy this and paste it into our receive. And we're going to modify it to no longer go to 0, but we're going to write, of course, a formula using our variable. So let's get rid of the 0 that's in there. And we'll hit the plus, and we'll choose this slider width variable that we just created. So what's going on here? We set up a receive for a message called set level, sent directly to the component instance. And we added a little bit of extra information that we are assigning to slider width. Then whenever we get that receive, we're going to now scale our slider to whatever the value of slider width was when it was received. If we go back to our scene and I preview this, you're going to see this all worked. Now, the interesting thing is, I don't know if you noticed in my demonstration, it animated. And you may not want that animation when the scene starts. So we can turn that animation off. Let's go back to our main component. And in the scale here, let's set this to 0, the duration. Okay, have a question in the chat. Could you recap what the parent meant? Was that just the main component? No, in this case, the parent is the scene. So I have, if I go back to my smart light scene, right, this is the parent. The parent is whatever contains an instance of that component. And I say that very specifically because it is possible to nest one component within another. That's beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, but the parent is always the item one up from the chain that is containing the instance of that component. In this case, the parent of the light slider component is the scene, smart light scene. Did that answer your question? So if a component lives in a frame, the frame is the parent of the component. Yes, that's correct. Okay, the last thing we did was, I'm gonna go back into the main component. The last thing we did was we turned off the animation. So when this set level is received from the parent, we were sending this right as the scene starts. So we might not want that to be animated. We might just want that to be instantly, we want that to be in position. So if I go back to the scene and now preview this, you're gonna see that my items are in place, and it doesn't matter if I change the value on here, you're gonna see that it's automatically in place, it's not animating. And if I now go back to my IoT home scene, let's preview that and just click on Smart Light, and you're gonna see I am now landing on my Smart Light control scene with all of my lights set at the values that I want them to be. Any questions on that? Okay, let's go back to the Smart Light scene. That's one way that we can initialize these components, but there's another way. There's another way that we can set these up to be in an initial state individually without using send and receive. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off this start trigger for now. And let's preview the scene. You're going to see it's no longer going to 100% for kitchen, 25% for bedroom, 0, 50%, etc. Right? It's just at whatever the default value in that component is. We can do the initial state in a different way, and that's using something called overrides. And if we go back into our main component, we have a variable for slider width. We can make it such that we can modify the value of this variable outside of the component from the scene. That's basically what I mean. So if I click on this slider width, and you're going to see in its configuration, you have this option to make overrideable. If I tick that and I go back to my scene, you're going to see now when I click on each of these instances, I have a new little space in my inspector on the right over here in the properties called overrides. And you're going to see my slider width variable is available for me to modify. So what I can do is I can say for the smart light, for the kitchen smart light, I want the slider width to be at the maximum. So let's say we want 279. And the bedroom. And because these are instances, each of these can be overridden to a different value. And the override is specific to the instance of the component, not to the main component. So in the bedroom, I want bedroom to be at what, 25%? What did we say that was, 70 pixels? And the dining room component, we're going to leave that at 0. And the living room component is going to be at the halfway mark, which is what, 140 pixels, I believe. Now let's preview this. And of course, nothing is still happening. And that's because we haven't told the component to do anything with that value. So in the same way, let's go back into our main component. In the same way, we instructed the component to scale when we got that set level message from the parent. We can use a start trigger. Now, components can have start triggers in the same way that the scene can. And essentially, when the component starts, and that means when the scene starts with a component in it, when that component starts, I can have it do something. And what I can do is I can copy this scale that we did from the receive. And let's paste that into our start. And what this is saying is that when the component starts, I'm going to scale the slider layer to the width of the value of the slider width variable. And because we made that variable overrideable, the value that we set in the scene is what's available to the instance of the component when it starts. So now if I preview this, you're going to see my kitchen's at 100%, my bedroom's at 25%, my living room's at 50%. And let's say I wanted the living room, let's say I want the dining room also at 50% like the living room, then, I click on the component instance in the layers palette, and the slider width, I'm going to set that to my halfway mark. And if I preview this, you're going to see now dining room's at 50%. Obvious question you might be asking is, well, if there's 2 ways to do it, why would I use one versus another? And that's a great question, and there's good reason for it to use one or another. Overriding the variable of an instance component is only applicable at the start of the scene. It's the simpler way to do things. So if all you care is initiating that variable or initiating the instance of a component to a specific state at the beginning of your scene, override is the easiest and simplest way to do it. But what's advantageous to using send and receive is that it's not limited to when the scene starts. I can execute this send response anytime. So let's say I wanted to make shortcut buttons to turn my kitchen all the way on or all the way off. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a couple of shapes here. I'm going to make a green box. So I'll turn this one, make this one green, and we'll call this one our on shortcut button. And I'm going to copy this and turn this red. And this will be my fully off button. That's more red, that one right there. And what I do is whenever I tap this, I want my kitchen to go to 100%. And whenever I tap this one, I want my kitchen to go to 0%. What I can do is I can reuse this send receive. So I'm going to add a tap trigger to the green box. And let's copy the send from my start trigger here. And we're going to send set level 279 to the kitchen. And let's add a tap trigger to the red one. And let's copy this one. We're going to modify it, but let's copy it. And instead of 279, the value that we're going to pass along with set level to the kitchen is 0. And let's rename this so that way it makes sense what we're doing. So when I tap the green one, it's going to send to the kitchen component the message set level, set it to 279, which is our full width, so fully on. And if I tap the red button, it's going to send the set level message to the kitchen instance, and it's going to set it to 0. So now when I preview this, everything is initialized based on what I set the overrides to be, but I can reuse the set and receive, send and receive. So now I can say if I click the red one, it goes to 0. When I click the green one, it goes to 100. Now you'll remember that we turned off the animation. So when I click these, it looks a little bit abrupt. What we can do now, because we've separated the override from the send and receive, we can leave the override on 0 animation. So my override that's used in my start, we'll leave that animation duration at 0. But when it's received in the set level message, let's set that animation back to what it was, which I believe was 0.2. So whenever the set level command is sent, then the scale animates. But when the scene starts, the scale doesn't animate. So it kind of gives us the best of both worlds. Let's go back to our scene. We'll preview this. Everything gets initialized immediately. And if I hit the red button, it goes to 0 and it animates. And if I hit the green button, it goes to 100 and animates. Okay, one question in the chat. Did we also make the text overrideable before we changed it from kitchen to bedroom, for example? Or is it overrideable only for variables? Okay, that's a great question. The text is overrideable, but in a different way. Because it is a text object in the layers palette, it's directly overrideable just automatically. So I can change the room name just literally by double clicking it and typing whatever I want here. It's already overrideable. There's nothing special you need to do other than make it a text layer. And the same thing is with images. Images are automatically overrideable. So if you want to change the icon for the kitchen, for example, you can replace it and it overrides that instance. The variable is a little bit different. Because the variable is a little bit of an inner workings, we needed to make it visible to the scene, and that's what the overriding does. Did that answer your question? Great. Okay. Awesome. So this is starting to get pretty powerful. But where things get amazing, can you show again how to start the animation from the override? Right. Okay, so we turn the animation off. So if you'll notice that all of these items are in place because we turn the animation off. But if I wanted that start, if I wanted the value or the width of that slider to animate at the start, if I go back into my main component, I need to do that in my start trigger here. So the start is what's using the value of the slider width variable using the overridden value. Currently, we have that animation duration set to 0. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set it to a long one. Let's set it to 1 second, just so that way it's obvious. So when the scene starts, the slider width is scaled to the value of whatever slider width is set to, and it will animate over 1 second. So let's go back to our scene. And if I preview this, you're going to see we just got our animation. And I'll reset it. And you might want this. You might want your scene to start with that animation in place. Completely up to you how you want to do it. I personally like it such that if I am initializing the state of the item to be in a certain state when it starts, I don't want that animated, which is why I turned it off. That answer your question? Great. All right. Let's get into one of the coolest features, I think, and one of the most powerful features that ProtoPie can do. It is possible for two prototypes to talk to each other. In the same way we did send and receive between the scene and a child component, we can send a message from one prototype to another to have this effect. And if you recall at the beginning, I showed you a prototype that looked like a floor plan. Or let's go back to the keynote here. And was it in here? Okay, it's not in here. In that case, then let's open up the second file we downloaded, and that was the one that had receive in the name. advanced2_2 receive assets.py. All right, here we have a prototype that simulates a panel that I might have in my home. Say it's mounted on the wall where I can control my smart home devices. What I would want is what I see in this panel to be in sync with what I see on my phone. I'm just going to resize these windows a little bit so it makes it easy for me to switch back and forth between the two. So here we go. You're going to see I have this yellow box here. It's this one called light on. This is the layer we're going to be working with. And this represents the light level of the living room. And we're doing that using the opacity here. So if the light's fully off, the opacity is going to be 0. And if the light's fully on, the opacity is going to be 100. And if it's somewhere in between, then it'll be somewhere in between. What we'd like to do is as we adjust the living room's light level between 0 and 100, we would like this to reflect in time the opacity that represents the same light level that's in here. So as I go to light level 100, opacity goes to 100. If I go to light level 50, it's going to go to 50% opacity, and et cetera. And we can use the exact same mechanism we did to talk to components. But instead of talking to a component, we can talk to another prototype. Now we want to do this from within the component itself, not from within the scene, because we have no information outside of here that lets us know what that brightness level is. That's all inside the component. So if I go into my light slider component, you're going to see I have two things that change in my prototype. I've got the scale of the slider, and I have got this brightness level, this brightness variable. And we could use either of those for what we want to do. But the interesting thing is the slider or the brightness value is already set up in the range of 0 to 100. And our opacity is on a range of 0 to 100. So it already matches. We don't have to do anything special to translate 0 to 100 when we send and receive that value. So the value of brightness is the right one to use. We also have a trigger that detects any time that brightness value changes, because we set up a detect for brightness. So anytime that brightness level changes, we want to send a message to the other component to say the brightness level has changed and we want it to change accordingly. So now that we've done that, we want to send a couple of things along there. First of all, let's set up our first send. We'll do a send. And in our channel, we're going to use this one. Remember I said how we're going to be working with another one, this ProtoPie Studio. This is the item that allows you to send messages between prototypes. So I'm going to choose ProtoPie Studio. And the message I want to send, let's say I want to call it set brightness. And let's send the value along with it. And the value I want to send along with it is the brightness variable. So whatever the value of brightness is, that's what I'm going to send along. And once again, let's go send brightness to other prototype. Now, if we were to take a look at our other one, and we could set up a receive for brightness in here, that'd be great. And the prototype would say, great, I received the brightness level. Which room? We haven't told it which room we want the brightness level to be changed in. So we need to send that too. Now you'll recall that I said that the room name here is always overridable. And we change the room name essentially just by double clicking it and putting new text in here. We can use that as our unique room to send along to the prototype. So whatever the value of the text property of the room name layer is, we're going to send that along to the other prototype. So it knows, okay, we're going to set the brightness to, say, 50, and we want that to happen in the living room. So let's do another send here. And we're going to send, again, ProtoPie Studio. And let's call this room name. And we're going to send a value together. And much like any other thing we've been doing today, we can use a formula for this. So I use a formula, and I want the text property of the room name text layer. Press plus, click on room name, press dot on my keyboard, and I'm going to choose text. And let's rename this. Send room name to other proto. Okay, so what's going on here? Every time the value of brightness changes, the detect trigger will fire. And previously we've used that to just update the percentage value that's displayed here. Now what we've done is we've modified that to also send information to the other prototype, so that way it can now be in sync with its light level. So we want to send brightness to the other prototype and room name to the other prototype, so it knows which room to affect. Let's go now to the other prototype. So we're sitting here in the multi-screen. We want to add a trigger. Anybody know what trigger we're going to add? Okay, we're going to add the receive trigger. Let me just drag these out so you can see. We're sending messages from the other prototype and receiving in this one. So the channel has to match. The channel will be ProtoPie Studio. The one quirk that you're going to need to deal with here is we don't get the dropdown that lets us know. So the ProtoPie will only know what messages are sent within its own pie kind of thing. It won't be able to recognize that you've got messages in the other one and give you the dropdown for that. So what we need to do is we just need to go back here and copy this. So the one message we're going to get is set brightness. So I'm going to receive through ProtoPie Studio the message set brightness, and I'm going to assign the variable. And I don't have a variable created, so let's make one. For this scene, you could use for all scenes or for this scene. This prototype only has one scene, so it doesn't really matter. We'll just use for this scene. And let's call this brightness. My receive is going to assign the brightness level to the variable called brightness. And that's all I need to do for this half of the receive. I need another receive for the room name. Receive from ProtoPie Studio, and that other one we called it send room name. I'm going to receive the message room name, and again I need to assign this to a variable. I don't want it to assign it to my brightness one because that's already being used for brightness. So I'm going to make a new one for this scene, and we'll call it room name. Okay, ProtoPie didn't like that. So a quirk, and this is something you need to understand. This applies to anytime you make a variable name. You can't use spaces in the variable name. So if you want something to look like a space, you can use an underscore, and that works fine. So room underscore name can be the name of my variable. So while my send and receive, you can have spaces in the message, variables cannot. All right. And the variable name I'm going to choose is room name. So I'm going to receive brightness and receive room name. Now what I want to do is I want to do something with that information. And I only want to change the living room's light value if the brightness level I received came from the living room component. And I know it's the living room instance of the component because the room name is living room. So what's going to happen is in all of the other, if I just go back to my scene here, sorry, I'm going to go back to the phone scene here. If I preview this, all of these are sending the brightness level. And the other component or the other prototype is receiving brightness from any one of these four. But it's also receiving the room name that's been typed in here. And I only want to change the brightness level in the living room if the room name value that's been passed is living room. So I'm going to ignore messages from these other three, and I'm only going to act on the living room one. So in my component, and let's rename these so we can see, receive brightness and receive room name. I'm going to use a condition here. And just like anywhere else, I can use formulas and conditions. And this goes back to, whose question was it earlier in the chat? Goes back to Sarah's question. Are conditionals available for syntax? And the answer to here is yes, and here's an example of how we can do it. Oops, let me go back to this one right here. So I can use a formula. Sorry, I'm going to use a variable here. I want to compare the room name variable, and I'm going to, it's not formula, sorry. In this case, it is the variable to a particular value. But you could use a formula. So if you needed to do a little bit of a calculation of what it is you want to compare, you can use a formula here. In this case, we're just going to use the room name variable. And if it's equal to a particular value, in this case, we want living room. And how we type this is very important. So if we go back to the other one here, we want to make sure this matches perfectly. So I'm going to copy this. And by matching perfectly, if I use a lowercase l, for example, or an uppercase G, it won't work. It's case sensitive. So you got to make sure that it matches perfectly, which is why all I'm doing is I'm just going to copy it. I don't trust my typing. And then go back here and I'm going to paste in the value living room. Oh, wait a minute, what's going on? Every time I paste it, it is disappearing. Anyone have an idea of why that might be? Okay, remember when we first talked about variables? And I said you had to pick a type, what kind of information you were going to store in there. The default for any variable is a number. But we don't want to store a number in there, we want to store text. So this is a good clue that something is wrong with the variable the way you set it up when you try to compare it against a value that ProtoPie doesn't like. So when I try to put text in here, you're going to see it doesn't like living room, but if I were to put 1, 2, 3, 4, which is a number, it keeps that, it likes that. We need to set up our variable as text. So room name needs to be text. Now, if I go back to my condition and I can paste in living room and it sticks this time. So when the room name is living room, then I want to change the living room's light level. And from here, it's a matter of adding an opacity response. And like anywhere else, I can use a formula for this. So I'm going to, in my formula, I'm going to use the brightness level. And that will animate over 0.2 seconds. You can literally set this to 0 and it would work fine as well, but we'll just leave it as is. It's not really that consequential. Now what we'd like to do is we'd like to see it in action. The problem you have in ProtoPie Studio is I can only preview one thing at a time. So I have the preview of my floor plan, or I've got the preview for my phone. So the limitation of working in this manner is that you have to run one of these prototypes on, excuse me, on another device. So in this case, I want to run this prototype on my phone. Hopefully this is going to work and I can demonstrate this in a very visual way. But if not, you may have to take my word for things working the way I like. But what I have on my phone is the ProtoPie Player app. And I have it plugged in. I have it plugged in with my cable on here. And you're going to notice that in the top right corner, you've got this device and it's green. And on my screen, you can see I've got that prototype on there. But what I'm going to try to do here is I'm going to try to mirror my phone screen. This doesn't always work. I'm going to try and mirror my phone screen so that way you can see this side by side. So let me bring up QuickTime. Give me a second. Okay, QuickTime player file, new movie recording, and let's see if it will mirror my phone. See if this works. It didn't work. All right. Oh, wait a minute. That's not the microphone. I want this one. Sorry, I picked the wrong one. Oh, there we go. Okay. What you're seeing in this window is my phone being mirrored. And if we go back to the other prototype, so not this one, we want the floor plan one. That's this one here. And I have that. And you're going to see now when I adjust the living room slider, then the opacity level in the floor plan is adjusting accordingly. Is that working for everybody? Yes, it's very cool, isn't it? So there is, before I show you one last thing, do you have any more questions on send and receive between prototypes? Okay, Sarah, I see your question. What would the repeat checkbox under send do? And it would work the same way as a repeat would work for any other animation. Literally, you could have it repeat the send a number of times or indefinitely if you wanted to, and you could space them out. Let's say you wanted to make a component that does a timer, you would need it to send an update every second. So you could have it do every second, send out the time value, and you could do something with that, for example. But it works in the same way you would repeat animation. Does that answer your question? All right, very good. You have one more option. If you're an enterprise customer, you can use something called ProtoPie Connect to see multiple things on the same screen. I'm going to close this. I don't need this running anymore. And we'll unplug my device here. I'm going to save these two works. From this point, you can just follow my screen. You won't be able to do this. But if you are an enterprise customer, you'll have a second tool called ProtoPie Connect. And ProtoPie Connect looks like this. Give me 1 second to start it. Here we go. And I can open multiple Pi files in here, and it doesn't have to be just two. I can multiply 3, 4, 5, whatever it happens to be. But I'm going to take these two that talk to each other, and you can drag them in from your file system, or you can use the plus button to add them in here. And then what I can do is I can say view all. And this shows me on one screen all of the prototypes that I dragged into Connect. So you can see the phone one has shown up. And we are waiting for the floor plan one to show up, which is, let's go back to Connect. Maybe I didn't have this. I want to run the both of these. Did I not share it? What's going on here? Sorry, give me 1 second. I've clearly not done something right. So I'm just going to remove them and add them again. Try it this way. We'll do the new. And I will browse to this one and this one. You're welcome, Sarah. I hope you found this useful. Okay, let's see if this works now. Okay, here we go. Now I see them both on the same screen. So you can see there's two prototypes. I've got my phone prototype on the left and my floor plan on the right. And now if I jump through and I navigate to my smart light, you're going to see I can move these left and right, and I see the update happening in the living room on the left. And let's say you had another prototype that simulated the actual light going on and off, right? You could have that playing in here as well. So you could have all three interacting with each other, and you could see it on one screen. So a nice little extra perk if you are an enterprise customer. Any questions on that? All right, well, we made it. We made it through some of the most powerful and I wouldn't say difficult to understand, but it's certainly the most complicated part of what ProtoPie can do. Can I access the recording of the session? Yes, it will be posted to our blog. I don't know exactly when, but it should be soon. So now it's time for you to unleash your ideas. Everything that you've learned in the last five sessions, you've gone from the simplest of tap triggers to making something happen on a phone, all the way to multiple prototypes talking to each other. You can do some really, really cool and complicated and complex stuff that does a great job of mimicking your idea. So it's excellent when you want to do some testing on a high fidelity prototype, and you know, when you want to actually show how something can work in the real world. Does anyone have any just general questions on what we went over today? Okay. Excellent then. One more thing, you'll notice a little bit further up in the chat, Rebecca left a link to the survey. This really helps us out. If you could go through and give us a little bit of feedback, what we did well, what could be improved. And this helps us with our with all of our workshops, and we can make things a whole lot better.